Hello, welcome to day 68. Yay. Okay, we are in the middle of a chapter that is shaping up to be a little boring, I fear, but maybe it'll get better. You really never know. Okay, we were on, I'm pretty sure it was at the end of page 479. I've been like marking when I leave off with a pencil, just like a very, if you're like a book preservation person, this might not make you happy, but I've been doing like a little mark at the part of the page where I leave off, and it has been life changing. I need to do this with every book I ever read. It's so nice. Okay. If one tried to plan public works in New York City by the same simplistic formula by which the public works of Long Island had been planned, the public works thus created might well destroy what was good in New York, even while it was supposed to be improving the city. Part of Moses's Long Island formula, the vision and the viciousness, the imagination and the ruthlessness, the drive, the urgent savage thrust, the instinct for the magnificent and the jugular that overrode purely selfish opposition, short-sightedness, and red tape to turn vision into reality, was needed in the city, needed desperately, for without it, the city would never be able to build parks and roads and bridges, or for that matter, housing or hospitals, sewers, or schools on the scale its citizens needed. I think I've said this so many times, but when Caro writes like this, I love it. Maybe some people would see this as over the top, like adjective city. I love it. I think that it's so fun. Like, yeah, the vision and viciousness, imagination and ruthlessness, the drive, urgent, savage thrust. I think he's great. But Moses's formula could be successful in the city only as the basis of a new, vastly more complicated and subtle and sophisticated formula, one that would turn public works into a far truer reflection of the subtle and complicated human needs they had to serve in the city. A whole new input, a factor of humanity, would have to be added. And Moses would not allow it to be added. Moses had a genius for grasping the needs of people in the mass, of people in the tens and hundreds of thousands, of a city and state as a whole, and for devising ways to meet those needs. But that genius could not help him grasp the needs of a specific city neighborhood in which he was building a small park or playground, for those needs might be shared by no other neighborhood in the world. In the first place, the people in the mass that he understood were people of people that he understood to be of a particular social strata than his own background enabled him to understand the classes he called upper and comfortable middle. He had never had any interest in, and therefore had little understanding of, classes he considered beneath his own, the classes who made up so much of New York City's neighborhoods. Moreover, even a genius could not deduce the needs of a neighborhood, any neighborhood, until he knew and understood it. And the only way of knowing and understanding it was to study and learn about it, to find out how many children lived in it and how old they were, what games they liked to play, what games their parents liked to play with them on weekends, what games their parents liked to play among themselves, to find out whether the parents liked to play games at all or simply sit quietly and talk, whether the neighborhood's teenage boys wanted a place to walk after dinner and watch the neighborhood's teenage girls walk, or whether they wanted to spend their time after dinner playing basketball, to find out which streets the neighborhood's mothers considered safe enough so that their children could cross them alone and thus use a playground on the far side whenever they wanted, and which streets the mothers considered too dangerous, to find out exactly how far the children were willing to walk to get to a playground in the first place. And there was only one way to learn about a neighborhood: listen to its people, discuss their problems with them. Unless Moses did that, not Moses himself necessarily, his lieutenants, or the architect designing the specific playground in question, he simply couldn't know enough about the neighborhood to satisfy its needs. On a broader hello, if you're just coming in, we're in the middle of the chapter that's called Driving. It might be 24, and so far the chapter has been like, it's been like, wow, can you believe it? Sometimes, even when you build public works, you're not actually helping, because sometimes the public works are getting in the way of great things that used to be there, which I think I kind of, went into this book, and that was pretty much the only thing I knew about Robert Moses. Like, sometimes the stuff he built was actually harmful and bad. And in the chapter, it seems like Robert Caro was really trying to like argue this, but I'm like, wait, I agree though. That's like, we get it. But it was written in the 70s, so. On a broader scale, that was also the only way to study and learn how to plan larger public works for New York City. It was the only way to plan even those large parks, Central, Prospect, Van Cortlandt, Cascina, Alley Pond, that contained plenty of space in which there lived no people at all. Even these parks could not be developed successfully by a formula as simplistic as that on which Long Island parks had been developed. For these parks were not just open space, but open space within a city in which open space was becoming terribly scarce. And the space within them was therefore precious and must be utilized not just to advantage, but to fullest advantage. And what was that advantage? What was it most important for those big parks to give the city? The city's facilities for active recreation were laughably inadequate. Therefore, the park must provide them. They must be filled with baseball diamonds and football fields, tennis and handball and basketball courts, skating rinks, and swimming pools. But the but the city was also growing and spreading. In 1934, most of Staten Island, the entire central portion of Queens, and much of southern Brooklyn were still free of intensive development. But real estate developers were already eyeing those areas too. Open space, quiet open space, natural settings in which city dwellers could find relief from gray concrete and congestion and noise was precious in New York now. Parks must provide that too. If they did not, there would soon be no place within the great city in which those values could be found. It was particularly vital that these values be preserved within the city because Moses's restrictive policies had made it difficult for the city's poor who did not have access to private automobiles to reach his Long Island parks. If these values were not preserved in the city's own parks, there would soon be no place at all in which a poor family could find them. Okay, side note, I went to my brother's graduation over the weekend and it was really fun. And I flew back on a plane, and as the sun was coming up and I was waking up from my red eye, I was looking down, and it was kind of amazing to see. I flew into JFK, which is in Queens, and it's right by Long Island. It was kind of amazing to see an aerial view of like all the bogs and marsh. I don't know if they're officially bogs, but like the marshland that Moses used to ride his boat through. There was a special name for the boat, I'm pretty sure, that I'm forgetting. But yeah, it was cool to see it from above because I had never really known it was there. I just don't go to Long Island a lot. Anyway, I was thinking of Bobby M. The city's parks had to serve both recreational and conservational functions, but designing the parks so that they could provide both functions would be immensely difficult. For the two functions were not compatible. Peace and quiet and solitude were, in general, obtainable only at a far remove from the shouts and frantic activity of the playing field. And while parks like Cascina in Queens were considered large, Cascina contained exactly 219 acres. 219 acres sounded big, but it sounded a lot smaller when one realized that a single baseball diamond took up 2.5 acres, and even a small parking field, 25. There was no room for parks like Cascina, either for peace or for parking fields. There was room in parks like Cascina for either peace or parking, but not both. With the exception of the two marine parks, which were not really parks at all, but only undeveloped marshland, the only park of 1,000 acres in the whole city was Van Cortlandt. And even in Van Cortlandt, you could have both active play facilities and natural, peaceful areas only if you exercise the greatest ingenuity and delicacy in laying them out. I have never been to Van Cortlandt Park. I've heard the name. I'm just looking it up because, it's in the Bronx. That's why I don't really go to the Bronx very often because it's the farthest away from where I am. Wow, yeah, it definitely looks really big. It's all the way up by Yonkers. Like, it's really just a stone's throw from Yonkers. It's like Fordham University is nearby, New York Botanical Gardens nearby. The Bronx Zoo is like sort of nearby. But even I bet if you went from the Bronx Zoo to Van Cortlandt Park, just because I bet it's like not even that close. I love the Bronx Zoo, by the way. Okay. Yeah, it would be 43 minutes on the bus from Bronx Zoo to Van Cortlandt Park. So clearly they're not even that close. Like it's really just way up there. I don't make it up there very much. I really don't make it up to like this whole, I know that we talked about it a lot in the bridge chapter, but like between Queens and the Bronx, there's that like weird area of the East River by Rikers and LaGuardia Airport, where like, you know, like the coastline is very jagged. Like the river is not the way you imagine a river to be. It feels kind of like there's so many bays, like Flushing Bay, and there's the Bronx River, and then another river. What's it called? The Westchester Creek. Like all of that area. Geographically, it looks really interesting, especially from above, but I just never go over there. I don't know the last time I've been on Throgs Neck Bridge before, but it's been like a long time. Okay, anyway, back to the book. If I can remember where I even was. So we're talking about blah blah blah. Therefore, choices had to be made, hard choices. And they could not be made intelligently without determining, in the case of each park, whether it was going to serve the neighborhood around it or the city as a whole, and which functions were most needed in that park by the people it was going to serve. There had been so much space on the island that there had been no need to ask such questions in planning parks, Long Island. Even after Moses had built all the baseball diamonds and tennis courts and bathhouses and parking fields that he wanted in Heckscher State Park, for example, more than 1,200 of the park's 1,657 acres remained in their natural wooded state, enough for green, quiet woods away from crowds. Moses himself had been uninterested in a park's natural functions. His mind saw people in the mass, running, jumping, swinging tennis rackets or baseball bats. Side note, I was looking at like really old Sears catalogs recently, and yes, I did listen to the episode with AOC. I thought it was kind of amazing. She knows the Bronx, you know, much better than I do, obviously, in Queens. Yeah, it was really fun. I also liked the structure, how they did, because they've had guests in the past that like knew the book better than others. And it's always fun when the guest really knows the book, and you feel kind of awkward and bad when the guest is just like adding things that and without like when the guest doesn't really know what was in the book or not because they didn't read it. And so I thought it was really nice that whether or not she read the book, which I think she did, I can't remember. They just had her first they like gave the overview of the book, and then it was like, AOC, you have the floor. And I liked how they divided it up. What was I gonna say? Oh, I was looking at an old Sears catalog from the 1890s and the early 1900s. Like a few of those Sears catalogs because they're on the Internet Archive, and they used to call tennis rackets tennis bats. Like they were selling these things, and they were like tennis bats, and then in a small font underneath, they were like rackets. I thought it was funny. Anyway, one reason he wanted Triborough Stadium so big was that he wanted it large enough for mass calisthenics on the Third Reich scale. He's a little bit of a Nazi. He's probably one of those guys that's like, Hitler had great ideas. His vision never focused on the individual wandering alone through a forest or on the family sprawling in solitude in a meadow. In thinking of parks, he did not, except incidentally, think of them as places of forests or meadows or solitude. And if the very breadth of his vision thus made it hard for him to think of parks as untouched nature, so did the very force of his creativity. He was a builder, a molder, a man who yearns to put his hands to and reshape, improve whatever he sees. Therefore, to him, a park was not open space. The open space was already there. The park was that portion of the open space that he had filled with his own creations. He referred to the portion of the Long Island parks without active play facilities as undeveloped for park use. His lack of interest in untouched nature had not mattered on Long Island, but it was to matter greatly in New York. This is the exact same thing we had with that lady, Iphigene Sulzberger, who was like, parks should be quiet, solitary places with no play structures and no children. And he was like, no. Okay, how small could a park be? What was the smallest number of square feet it was feasible to supervise and maintain as a public place of recreation? 5 acres, the area of a standard city block. 3 acres, 2, 1. The 100 by 20 feet that was the size of the standard building lot in tenement sections, and that was often the only piece of vacant land anywhere around. 100 by 20 feet is a weird shape for a park, but I would still go to it. That could be fun. This was a question of desperate importance. The recreational needs of city families that couldn't afford to own a car, and those families comprised a full 2/3 of the city's population. I think what surprises me more is that in the late 1930s, 1/3 of New York families did own a car. That is more surprising to me. But also, I'm curious what it is now, because I always think of New York as no one having a car, but in Queens and southern Brooklyn and the Bronx, everyone has a car. I don't know. I'm curious. And Staten Island. Okay, anyway, the recreational needs of people without cars had to be satisfied within their immediate neighborhoods, and because it was too expensive to condemn buildings in these neighborhoods, and the only land still vacant was small plots, the only parks that could be built were small parks. But even small plots were enormously expensive to maintain and supervise, far more expensive per square foot than large parks. Given the hard fact that the city would never be able to create nearly enough parks for its people, was there any sense in developing a large number of small parks? Where did you think these resources? Where did you sink those resources that were available? Into large parks that could be developed relatively economically, or into small parks that alone could provide recreation for that portion of the city's people that most needed recreation? The needs of providing recreation for the city's poor must be weighed against the cost of that provision. What a later generation would come to call priorities must be established, and it would not be easy to establish them. The hard choices would have to be made. Only by the most intense analysis and discussion with the people most directly involved, the city's poor, could these choices be made intelligently. And again, because the success of a neighborhood park depended so largely on intimate knowledge of that neighborhood, once the decision to establish a park in a neighborhood was taken, even more intense discussion with the residents of that neighborhood would be necessary. This is like this whole chapter is like fine, it's good, but I'm like, man, you can kind of tell. Part of me wonders, like, his editor famously cut like half of this book, and it still ended up being 1,100 pages. You wonder if like maybe his editor, Richard Gottlieb, maybe he like forgot this chapter. I feel like this chapter is like a little repetitive, but I don't know, maybe it's just me. Anyway, then there was the question of roads in parks. Should there even be roads in parks? And if so, where within the parks should they be located? Once in the days, a decade or even 2 decades before, in which the young Robert Moses had been planning parks and roads, the answer to that question had been quite clear. Driving in automobiles had then still been thought of primarily as pleasure. That is so funny. A pursuit for comfortable middle class or wealthy fathers, the only fathers who could afford automobiles, taking their families for an outing, just as driving a horse-drawn carriage had been a pursuit for pleasure. And it had therefore been important to ensure that these families had the most pleasant surroundings possible to drive through, and within the city's limits, the most pleasant surroundings were those provided by parks. The provision of pleasant scenery for drivers to enjoy was, in fact, a primary function of parks. What? This is brand new to me. I'm writing this down. That was why every great city in Europe had its great driving pleasure. Okay, I'm going to pronounce some things wrong, sorry. Paris, it's Bois de Boulogne. If you've been there, say something in the chat, because I have never been to any of these places. Rome had Pincian Hill. Florence, it's Cascine. And London, it's Hyde Park. Okay, I have been to Hyde Park, and it's beautiful. I'm just not very well traveled. Anyway, roads had belonged in parks in the 19th century. So much that, if necessary, other values of a park had to be sacrificed to provide the roads with the best of the park's scenery. But this was, I just noticed that Pearl's like in the back just chilling. She loves this green chair. I'm gonna pull her in view. Okay, so won't someone think of the drivers in the park? Okay, but this was the 20th century now, and the answer to the question, do roads belong in parks, was no longer clear. For the nature of driving had largely changed. The automobile age, still in its infancy when Robert Moses had stood on Riverside Drive and planned his great highway going uptown along the water in 1914, still only in its adolescence when Moses had been planning his Long Island Parkways in 1924, the automobile age had come to full maturity by the time he came to power in New York City in 1934. There had been 273,435 motor vehicles in New York City in 1924. Okay, side note, that is such a precise number. I would love to see like the registration data. Anyway, so that was in 1924. There were 804,620 now, so like 3.5 times as many. And people no longer use their cars primarily for weekend pleasure trips, but increasingly to get to and from work and to shop. Cars were part of people's daily lives. And they drove faster now. They had less time for scenery. What implications did these facts have for parkways? What was a parkway anyway? Was it still mainly a source of beauty and pleasure, or had it changed into a source of convenience, or at least intended convenience? Were people still interested in parkways primarily because of the scenery they could see along them, or were they interested in them primarily as a means of getting from one place to another? And if the latter, what was the significance of that fact? Should the best of scenery still be reserved for the driver? This paragraph and kind of this whole chapter has been interesting because unlike pretty much every chapter that I'm remembering, there's a lot of like back-to-back questions. Like you can tell that Robert Caro is trying to show us the questions that Robert Moses was or should have been asking. But it reminds me of this guy named Clive Thompson, and his book is like on my shelf if you want to see the one that's like the third shelf down in yellow. It's called Coders. But anyway, he's just a normal guy also. And he made this tool where you can copy and paste text, I think, and then it takes out all of the text and it just shows you the punctuation. And it's only interesting when you like use it to examine a writer's style and the punctuation they prefer. But yeah, I feel like with this book it would be interesting because there's so much punctuation and there's so many dashes and the sentences are really long often. But yeah, then randomly you get like these bouts of like question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. Okay, anyway, but Robert Moses would not allow any discussion. He wouldn't allow discussion because discussion would have slowed down his building programs, and he felt that he couldn't allow them to be slowed down. And he wouldn't allow discussion because he had no respect for the opinions of the public that he would have had to admit. He had no respect for the opinions of the public that he would have had to admit to the discussions. And even if he limited discussion to the experts who were interested in the various fields, he had no respect for their opinions either. Robert Moses had no respect for anyone's opinion but his own. Once Moses had at least listened to his own aides, allowed them to argue with him, tested his opinions against theirs. But now that had changed too. In the first days of his power, he had hired aides whose opinions were worth listening to. He had selected men for ability, engineering ability, legal ability. The aides he was hiring now had also to possess an additional quality, the ability to say, "Yes, sir." Lunches at Moses's office were really starting to get pretty sickening, recalls one top LaGuardia official. Even if he only had one guest, he would always have 6 or 8 of his Moses men, my muchachos, he used to call them, at the table. And it was all, "Yes, sir, RM. No, sir, RM. Right as usual, RM. When he laughed, they laughed, only louder. You know what I mean. Christ, when he made a statement, you could look around the table and see 8 heads nodding practically in unison. It was like a goddamned Greek chorus." Reuben Lazarus, invited by Moses to become chief counsel for the Triborough Bridge Authority, refused. "I didn't want to be a doormat for any man." And when Moses asked him to recommend one of his assistants, Lazarus selected the one who, he had noticed, doesn't answer back, and in the taxi, taking William Lebwall to lunch with Moses, told him what was going to be expected of him. "You're going to have to be able to bend over and take a kick in the ass and say thank you, sir," with a smile. At the luncheon, Lazarus recalls, Lebwall did not answer back. Moses hired him and kept him on as Triborough counsel for more than 30 years. The effect of such a hiring policy was predictable. The aides he had hired in the 1930s, in the aides he hired in the 1920s, the Art Howlands, Sid Shapiro's, Bill Latham's, Bill Chapin's, and George Spargos. See, those are names where we've definitely seen them before, but I can't remember what they did. Anyway, the people he hired in the 20s, they became legendary throughout the state and city government for their ability, drive, and this is a hard word to pronounce. Indefatigability. Indefatigability. They're indefatigable. The aides he hired in the 1930s were quite another story. The older guys, tops, says William Zeckendorf, who had a keen eye for men himself. But some of the others he had working for him, I wouldn't have hired them to sweep my lobbies. Moses' sensitivity to criticism had impressed itself on such men. They didn't criticize anything he said. They saw he was less than receptive to suggestions, and they didn't make suggestions. If Moses refused to accept ideas from public. Sorry, I got distracted because my friend texted me. I need to stop getting distracted. Oh, hello, Tate. Welcome. Yeah, we're in the middle of the chapter called Driving. We're on page 485, like kind of we're almost halfway. Yeah. If Moses refused to accept ideas from public experts or aides, from, in general, anyone at all, the source of his ideas, the concept of public works for New York City, could only come from his own mind. The mind was brilliant, but even a brilliant mind is only as good as the material, the input, fed into it. It was about this time that Lazarus, planning to write a book about government and public figures and keeping a card file of impressions, wrote on a card he filed under the name Robert Moses. Here's a quote from this Lazarus guy. Bob Moses had climbed so high on his own ego, he became so hidebound in his own arbitrariness that he has removed himself almost entirely from reality and has insulated himself within his own individuality. This difficulty could, to some degree, have been overcome by sheer mental ability. Robert Moses' mind was supple, resourceful. He's done this multiple times where he describes people's minds as supple. Even without input of social and human considerations, it could have deduced some of these considerations simply by thinking about the problems involved. But Robert Moses no longer had much time to think. Building a state park system had been an immense job, but he had brought it not only immense energy, but immense ability to discipline that energy. He had fought time, made time, to be more precise, make it by devoting to his work the hours when other men play or relax or sleep, or lunch. Made it by working 14, 16, 18, 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. He had found time to oversee every detail of design, to present his architects and engineers with the basic concepts he wanted followed, to insist during the fleshing out of those concepts a standard of excellence, of boldness and daring, far above that common for public works, and to inspire the architects and engineers. I know you can do drawbridges. Can you do beautiful drawbridges? To raise their work to that standard. I know that it's impressive how much he works, but I've always thought it's more impressive that he was going out and swimming pretty much every morning. Besides furnishing inspiration, he furnished ideas. Many of the most brilliant touches at Jones Beach had been his ideas. Jones Beach was the one that I'm pretty sure Jones Beach was the one that they made like ship themed. Everything was, everyone wore like little sailors costumes. He found time, made time, to infuse the brick and concrete and sandstone of that park, and of other Long Island parks from Valley Stream to Montauk, and of other state parks from Palisades to Niagara, with his personal genius. But when Moses expanded his sphere of activity into New York City, he did not stop his work on Long Island or in the rest of the state. In 1934, on Long Island alone, he built Bethpage State Park and Bethpage State Parkway. In 1935, he built the Meadowbrook Causeway. In 1936, he built great new bathhouses at Sunken Meadow and Heckscher State Parks, as well as the Heckscher State Parkway Spur. What's a Parkway Spur? Does anyone know? And during all these years, he was extending the northern and southern state parkways and building literally scores of smaller park structures. Instead, he simply added to his state park work itself enough to tax the strength of even the strongest of men, work in the city that was not limited to the direction of 80,000 men in the rebuilding of a huge park system, but that also included the building of 4 parkways and 3 bridges, with each of the bridge building jobs in itself a job that would have been considered a full-time job for any man. It was not possible for him to make for himself any more time than he had already made. There were no more days in a week than 7, or weeks in a year than 52, and he was working all of those days and weeks already. He had already sloughed off all social life and most family life. There was nothing more in his life that could be sloughed off. Wait, Tate, as someone who has read the book, do we ever learn more about his family? Because the whole time I'm dying to know how it's going with his wife and his daughters, whom he never seems to hang out with, except for occasionally. Like for a while when he was working in the Long Island parks, they said that he would have like Sunday family days. And remember, Mary was the one that could get him to stop working. And so then his employees would call Mary and they'd be like, please, like, come to the office, like, make him come home. And so then she would have to like storm in and be like, time to come home. And then everyone would be able to get off work. But yeah, I'm very curious about them because she seems like she's not better than him. Wait, when she made him apologize at that party? Now I can't remember. Also, wait, I just realized that since he has 2 daughters, maybe more that we haven't heard about, he probably has, like, his daughters, would they be alive now? Maybe. Probably not, but maybe. He would definitely have grandkids that are alive. Kendrick Lamar could find them. Yeah. Wait, remind me of the apology at the party because it's like I definitely like have the memory lodged in there, but I can't remember what the context was. He had already sloughed off all social life and most family life. There was nothing more in his life that could be sloughed off. I might be saying that word. It's Sloughed. I've read it before. I don't know how to pronounce it. He was already, with his use of his limousine as an office and a conference room, making use of every available minute. There were no more minutes to be found unless he drove himself beyond the limit of his physical and mental and emotional strength. And the almost nervous breakdown of December 1934 had shown how close he was crowding that limit. It was lack of time more than any other single reason that accounted for an astonishing fact about many New York City park projects. They were banal. Richard Spencer Childs, okay, I will never forget this character because this is a guy that like we get quotes from randomly, but I don't think he's actually that important. But his name sounds like the KKK guy, but it's just but there's luckily Childs at the end. Richard Spencer Childs recalls visiting Moses at his office one day and having their conversation interrupted by the arrival of Aymar Embury. Is Embury one of the reformers from back in the day? I don't know. We'll see. Embury had a bunch of drawings of some buildings for... Who's Aymar Embury? Sorry, I forgot. I totally remember. Oh, he's one of the architects. Okay. Sorry, it's hard to remember these people. I'm also looking at Richard Spencer Childs to see if he's important. Yeah, no, Richard Spencer Childs is a business executive and political reformer. He has no Wikipedia article, but he does have a Wikidata item, so that shows you how notable he is. So Embury says, okay, Richard Spencer Childs recalls visiting Moses at his office one day and having their conversation interrupted by the arrival of Aymar Embury, who's an architect. Embury had a bunch of drawings of some buildings for the parks, Childs recalls. He had brought them to show Moses. Moses went right through them. Nope, okay, nope. Throwing them to one side or the other if he approved them or not. There were no hard feelings. Moses and Embury were good friends. There was lots of respect between them. But here, perhaps, $100,000 worth of public business was settled on Moses's offhand taste. And, recalls Childs, when Moses finished with the drawings, Embury pointed to one he had rejected and said, "That one you threw away was the best of the lot." Embury may well have been correct. The offhand taste, even of a genius, is offhand taste. Working incredibly fast, Moses had managed to make the Long Island projects public works of genius. Now he was trying to work even faster, and he was working too fast to do even a good job. Oh, okay, now I'm remembering. Yeah, that just happened. I forgot. Yeah, oh, that was see, sometimes she's sweet. Like I know that she like allows him to be annoying and a workaholic and ridiculous and mean and potentially a little bit like abusive in the workplace. But also, yeah, whenever we do get like appearances from Mary, I feel like she's always like being the voice of reason, like being like, "Hey, maybe don't trash our friend who we're going to a New Year's party with in the press. Like maybe not. Maybe she's our friend." Yeah, I don't know. I want more about Mary. When there is no time for the thinking required for original creation, the tendency is to repeat what has proven successful in the past. Many of Moses's New York projects, not all, those in which he was particularly interested and on which he spent substantial time, would be magnificent additions to the civic estate, but many of them began to reveal a conscious effort to duplicate aspects of his acclaimed Long Island parks. In this tendency lies the explanation for the otherwise inexplicable failure to make provision for baby carriages at so many New York parks. No provision for baby carriages had been necessary at the entrances to the Long Island parks because people got to them by automobiles. Also, what does that even mean? Like a parking lot for strollers? I don't know. Anyway, if there was a difference that should have been obvious to Moses, that the parks he was building now would be used by mothers who walked to them instead of drove, Moses was simply too busy to see it. At Embury's drawings, Moses at least had time to glance. For more and more small park projects, even at a glance, could not be spared. Moses found himself forced to delegate all authority for them to subordinates. Authority is delegatable, genius is not. Some of the men to whom the work was delegated were first-rank architects or engineers. Many of them, in fact, for the Depression, had driven into the arsenal many brilliant young professionals who in ordinary times would have been making names for themselves in private commissions. But they were not Robert Moses. The further Moses's presence receded from individual small park projects, the less distinguished these projects emerged. In designing the Central Park Zoo, the 79th Street Boat Basin, Jacob Riis Park, Orchard Beach, the 10 big neighborhood swimming pools, problems were solved with ingenuity and thoughtfulness. Perhaps also, by the way, just another great moment that I just wanted to say out loud again so I don't forget it. Remember when they opened a pool and then as the celebration, they had a, what was it called again? A water clown? And then I looked up water clowns in the newspaper archive, and there was, like, only really one mention of it that was totally unrelated. Like, he just, like, made up water clowns. That was amazing. Like, that was great evidence that he's a genius. Like, he just made up water clowns. Anyway. Okay, so he's opening all this stuff. Perhaps if he had been able to take the same interest in all park problems, the problems involved, say, in the location and design of a neighborhood playground, all park problems would have been solved with ingenuity and thoughtfulness. But Moses was not taking the same interest in all park problems. And in fact, as the number of park projects multiplied, spread by the hundreds across the face of the great city, he was able to take a substantial interest in only a very small percentage of them. In, for example, only a handful of the hundreds of neighborhood playgrounds. The inevitable result was made more striking by the need for haste. Building hundreds of playgrounds as fast as possible is easy if a single basic design is used. And by the need for design approval by the WPA, an Army engineer staffed agency in which simple designs and cheap materials rather than architectural excellence were the order of the day. Parentheses, Moses had to fight for every amenity, no matter how small. Every improvement on the basic blocky comfort station design represented a victory, hard won. Because two-story structures required more expensive structural steel than one-story, Moses had to plead with the WPA for weeks for approval of Amar Embury's masterful classic colonnaded interpretation of his insistence that the Orchard Beach bathhouse blend in with the hilly, wooded landscape behind it. And when the structure was almost finished at a cost of $1 million, the WPA flatly refused to spend $2,500 more for two clocks that Embury had envisioned as grace notes on its towers. That's very beautiful. Moses obtained that money. I'm like predicting. I would have guessed that he would have just like asked his mom, which is what he always says when he needs money, but no, he didn't actually. He got that money only by begging LaGuardia for it. There was to be no Barbizon brick and Ohio sandstone in New York City parks. Concrete, plain unadorned concrete, and brick, plain red brick, the cheapest made, were what the WPA had in mind. Moses was able to relieve the blankness of the concrete Orchard Beach bathhouse only by finding a mysterious source of terracotta tiles, which, while cheap, at least added some necessary color, a chaste blue, to their unrelieved grayness. Okay, you can't just like add a line about a mysterious source of terracotta tiles. What is that? Where are you finding this mysterious source? I don't even know what that means. I would love at least one paragraph on that. While Moses was willing to fight endlessly and ingeniously to make his big projects as perfect as possible, it was obviously unfeasible to battle over the details of every playground when one was building hundreds, especially since arguing about every design would have cost him his great advantage over other city departments with the WPA. The fact that when his new funds became available, his plans were ready to go. A standard park department playground design was evolved and architects were given little leeway to deviate from it. If there was to be an indoor playhouse in the playground, there was a standard design for that, too. And if the architect wanted to make variations in it, they had better be small ones. These designs were banal, containing, for the most part, nothing but benches for mothers and standard active play equipment, swings, seesaws, jungle gyms, wading pools, slides, for children. The equipment was surrounded by fences that only a mother could love. Oh, you're being so mean. It's just, okay. Either dreary chain link or high black bars that made the playgrounds look like animal cages. Oh, the horror. And they were set in a surface that even a mother had to hate. Surface cheap to lay down and easy to maintain. That was why Moses' engineers had selected it. But okay, this actually sounds really bad. Hard on the knees and elbows of little boys and girls who fell on it. Comfort stations, squat and unadorned, looked like nothing so much as concrete or brick pill boxes. A neighborhood committee might request some particularly desired facility, a bocce court, for example, for an Italian neighborhood, but few substitutions were permitted. Then, also, okay, one second. I'm just gonna pause to look up how long was the WPA from the New Deal? Like, how long did that last? Because I feel like the Works Progress Administration, I think of it as not lasting until 1939, but clearly it he's building stuff with that money in 1939. Okay, it was set up on May 6, 1935. Oh my goodness, happy 90-year birthday to the Works Progress Administration. I didn't even realize what day it was. That's amazing. Okay, so it set up May 6, 1935, and it spent I'm on Wikipedia. The first appropriation was for $4.9 billion, which is $15 per person in the US. Which feels like kind of a lot. That seems awesome. Most of the jobs were in construction, like streets and bridges and airports and housing. Whoa. I didn't know this. In 1942, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, was pretty much the reason that was the building and the staffing of Japanese internment camps. At its peak in 1938, it had jobs for 3 million unemployed men and women. That's so insane. U.S. population in 1938. That's so crazy. That's so many people. The population was 129 million. So that's like I guess like 2.5% or something of all people were employed by them. Okay, now I'm getting distracted. It lasted until 1943 is the answer. 1935 to 1943, which is that's nuts that there was like a period where we were both in World War II and just hemorrhaging money on the New Deal. Okay, anyway, I really feel like I don't know enough about American history. Thanks for letting me have that little moment. Then there was the difference in usage accorded parks in the city, a difference complicated by vandalism. Designing for hard usage was not always compatible with designing for beauty, as was demonstrated by the evolution of the marginal playgrounds in Central Park. At first, the playgrounds were equipped, in addition to the swings, slides, and jungle gyms, with sandboxes, tunnel segments that children loved to crawl through, and with striped, turreted little toy guardhouses that served as play booths. And their peripheries were only a ring of benches backed by trees and shrubs that provided shade for mothers and that screened the noise of playing children from the apartment houses across the street. Dogs wandered into the playgrounds and urinated and defecated in the sandboxes, and the sandboxes had to be removed. Oh wow. Okay, that's a good It's so hard to get to dig in the city. Remember, like before Moses came along, kids were lining up around the block for a little plot of dirt to take their turns digging. Now they're trying to dig and they're getting dog poop. Ugh. Drunks crept into the tunnels. Drunks crept into the tunnel segments at night and fell asleep, to be discovered by children the next morning sleeping in their own vomit. The tunnel segments had to be removed. Drunks wandered into the striped guardhouse play booths during the day and urinated in them. Oh, perverts used them as hiding places from which they could watch the playing little girls and boys at close ranges and masturbate. I should not laugh, but vandals pried loose the light lumber out of which the play booths were constructed. The play booths had to be removed. Then the drunks slept, and the perverts hid in the trees and shrubbery behind the benches, so this landscaping had to be removed. Still, drunks kept wandering into the playgrounds at night. Moses tried to keep them out at first by putting up bars between the bench groupings and little gates at the playground entrance as a warning to stay out, but the drunks ignored the warning, and finally Moses felt he had no choice but to surround the playgrounds, now reduced to amenity-bare patches of asphalt with high fences whose gates could be locked at night. Critics might rage that the playgrounds now resembled animal cages. Moses saw that resemblance himself. He just felt that there was nothing he could do about it. Young architects like Robert Weinberg argued among themselves. Their park department superiors wouldn't listen to them, that solutions to the difficulties inherent in intensive usage could be compatible with good design. All that was needed, they felt, was imagination and an understanding of the basic needs of the neighborhoods in which the playgrounds were located. Including a bocce court in a playground instead of a row of swings was not, after all, a task requiring immense creativity. Weinberg was particularly incensed at one design defect that reduced the usefulness of many playgrounds and that could have been cured very easily indeed. Some playgrounds were situated atop hills, and their entrances were set with flights of steps, despite the fact that the most frequent users of these parks were mothers with baby carriages. Yeah, see, that's like, maybe I shouldn't act like it's so obvious, but like what? I feel like that's really, I don't know. I just kind of think if I were designing a park, like I would have realized that. Which were difficult to maneuver up steps. An entrance to these playgrounds could have been made easier for them by simply making the entrances ramps instead of steps. But Moses no longer had much time for detail. His imagination was as vigorous as ever. The big projects in which he took a personal interest were innovative, ingenious, daring, and bold. To a considerable extent, as carefully thought out in both overall conception and minute details as his Long Island parks. Smaller projects which happened to fall under his gaze, Carl Schurz Park on the East River at 86th Street, which he passed on his evening walks from his Gracie Terrace apartments, were just as carefully thought out. There are, throughout the New York City park system, small touches of beauty. Comfort stations, for example, that are proof that even a bathroom can bring beauty to a cityscape. But inquiry reveals that most of these structures are the rare ones in which, for one reason or another, Moses took a personal interest. I've been reading for like 49 minutes now, but it's kind of fun. I'm just going to keep going a little bit longer. In building his state parks, Moses had been uninterested in building for the lower classes. He was still uninterested, although now he was building parks in the city where those classes lived. Moses had begun his park commissionership by enthusiastically gobbling up vacant city-owned lots in the slums with the intention of turning them into tiny parks. But this enthusiasm soon waned. The effort involved in creating such vest pocket parks was immense. The land acquisition alone, The The land acquisition alone involved the approval of countless agencies and officials, and therefore endless red tape. Designing something that would make a tiny lot attractive or useful was difficult. Because you couldn't afford to keep a full-time supervisor on duty in every vest pocket park, those small parks located in slums quickly became filled with rubbish and winos. The reward involved in creating, I don't really know what a vest pocket park is. The rewards involved in creating vest pocket parks were, moreover, not at all commensurate with the effort required. If the reward was a sense of achievement, what, to the creator of Jones Beach, was the achievement in creating a tiny bit of green space or a few benches or a seesaw or two? I guess they're just really small parks. Moses had always thought on the grand scale. That was his genius, the ability to grasp the needs of a whole city or state and devise a means of satisfying them. And this quality of mind made it difficult for him to take much interest in something small. There was something inherently good in size itself, he seemed to feel. If the reward was public applause, the size of the reward for building a vest pocket park was small indeed. Editorial writers didn't get nearly as excited about a tiny park as they did about a Randall's Island or Orchard Beach. It was the great projects that awed them. Size seemed to signify significance to them, too. Whatever the reasons, RM, an aide would say, just wasn't interested in anything small. He used to say, "That's a little job, give it to so-and-so." And that attitude filtered down, so that the fellows weren't interested in small things either. Coupled with his feelings about the people for whom the effort would have to be made, the lower classes who didn't respect or appreciate what was done for them, in particular, black neighborhoods, which were dirty and wouldn't keep his beautiful creations clean, according to him, his lack of interest in anything small made him uninterested in small parks in slums. I'm going to read one more paragraph, I think. Within a year, the Vest Pocket Park program was all but dead, and he was determined that it wouldn't be revived. He flatly refused a 1936 offer of small, abandoned transportation board plots, calling them of no use to this department because they are too small. The program never really got off the ground except in two areas: the Irish Catholic slums of the Lower East Side, in which Al Smith, and hence Moses, still took an interest, and LaGuardia's old Little League of Nations, East Harlem Congressional District. In other slum areas, there was almost no park development at all after 1935. And the lack was particularly marked in Black Harlem and in the South Jamaica and Stuyvesant Heights tenement districts in Queens and Brooklyn, into which a steadily mounting overflow from Harlem had begun to creep. The protests about this policy from the slums themselves were faint and few. Slum dwellers, particularly slum dwellers with black skin, weren't making many protests in the 1930s, but some reformers raised their voices on their behalf. Okay, I'm going to stop there. That was I feel like I made a lot of progress today. I kind of we did a lot of pages. I think we did 11 pages, which in this book is a lot. Oh, Moses' response. How long is his response to the power broker? I would love to read that. It's hard to imagine him maybe it's not hard to imagine him reading it all the way through. Wow. Only 20 pages. I'm excited to read it. Should I wait until I finish the entire Power Broker until I read his response? There aren't really I'm not really afraid of spoilers, since you can just look around New York and see the spoilers for this book. Nice guys finish last. Oh, he thinks he's a victim. Okay, I'll wait to the end. Yeah, all the spoilers. Okay, well, have a good Monday. Thanks for joining. I didn't have high expectations for this chapter, but it ended up actually being fun. So, thank you. Goodbye.